Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be another reaction style video, which are honestly some of my favorite videos to film recently. As someone who's been on the internet now for over 10 years, I have quite the backlog of videos that I haven't thought about in a very, very long time. So today I thought it would actually be fun to go to my most viewed video of all time, which is a fantasy recommendations video that I posted now over 6 years ago to see if I still stand by, one, the recommendations themselves, and if any of the books are still some of my favorite fantasy reads of all time, because obviously I've read a lot of new things since that point in time, so I'm curious to see how my taste has evolved and changed, and maybe cringe a bit as we watch this older video together. So without further ado, let's go ahead and react to this video. I'm a little scared. This is definitely a video I have not watched in some time. I had this habit of screaming in my videos back in the day, and I feel like this one is particularly a bad one in that case, and so many people have seen it, and I like to just think about how no one has actually seen it, you know what I mean? Hey guys, it's Reagan, and today I'm here to do one so forceful. So forceful. Also, this is my Chicago apartment, really bringing back memories. All right, so first things first, we're gonna start with the Mac Daddy, probably my favorite book of all time. My favorite book of all time? What was my favorite book of all time in like 2017? I have no idea. Probably most definitely my favorite fantasy series of all time. A novel a lot of people were confused weren't involved in my last video, and that is because I hadn't read them. But I have now, and that is The Name of the Wind, or The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Oh, if only 2017 Reagan only knew that we are still waiting for that third and final book within that trilogy. Bless her heart. Okay, Name of the Wind. The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. This is definitely a fantasy series that I have enjoyed immensely. I think over the years, the more I have been away from the series, it's moved down the ranks for me in terms of like favorite fantasy series of all time. And if you've seen any of my more recent recommendations videos, this book isn't really on those lists anymore. But before we dive into like my thoughts about the series now, let's figure out my thoughts about that series then. Any fantasy book that you needed to pick up tomorrow, it would be this. This is the most incredible fantasy story I have ever read. It's lyrical, it's beautiful. Patrick Rothfuss takes our plot to places you couldn't expect. It's so interesting too, because like I have since read like by far my favorite fantasy series of all time, which is Robin Hobb, anything by Robin Hobb, and like the Kingkiller Chronicle is excellent. It's definitely a very beloved fantasy series in the space. Wouldn't say it's my favorite of all time, and I definitely wouldn't put it even in like my top 10 ranking at this point, but it is really good, and I am looking forward to the final book whenever it decides to come out, which at this point I feel like it's never gonna come out. But if you're not familiar, the Kingkiller Chronicle is a fantasy story following our main character Kvothe, and we find him kind of much later in his life in this sort of abandoned tavern working there. Basically, a chronicler comes in, and finally Kvothe begins to tell the story of his life, leading up to the moment of like where he is now. And over the course of the first two books, we're basically reading Kvothe's past. First book is really him being in magic school, going on various quests. He's kind of like a chosen one character, very talented, talented musician, like all of these things. I will stand by what I said in that video, that this series does have a really nice lyrical writing style. It's very immersive, and in terms of writing style, it's very palatable in contrast to maybe like Brandon Sanderson, which has a more straightforward writing style, or like George R.R. Martin, who has a more classical fantasy style. It's like a very pretty writing style that I did enjoy. One additional thing I'll say about this series that Patrick Rothfuss does that I just really loved, and I feel like was one of the first times I encountered it in a fantasy story, not to say that Patrick Rothfuss was the first to do it, but it was this sort of reflective style in storytelling. Our character in the future letting us know events that happened in the past, creating this situation where there's a little bit of dramatic irony or even a little bit of a reflective element for our main character as they're recounting these events. This is something I love in books, and I've since encountered it now in many, many, many fantasy series, and I just love that style of storytelling. Tearling Trilogy, for example, also has this. It's just like really good. It's definitely a good series. I would still definitely recommend it, but again, the title of it being my favorite fantasy series of all time has for sure passed on since I put out this video, and I'm almost sad for 2017 Reagan because I still haven't been able to complete it. And I'm sorry to let her know that. All right, let's move on to my second favorite series of all time. Moving on now to a series I feel like I haven't actually mentioned in a minute, and that is the Tearling Trilogy by Erica Johann. I stand by this rec. Again, it probably wouldn't make my like all-time favorites at this point, but this is like a solid, very entertaining. Same with the last one, obviously. The Name of the Wind is like a very solid fantasy series. One I'd still recommend, and it's super unique. I feel like the series in general is underrated, but I really loved the sequence of this. But let's see what I had to say about it at the time.
Most unique fantasy trilogies of all time in terms of plot lines, character arcs, and where Erica brings our story to. You really go.
Honestly, I stand by that assessment still to this day. The Tearling Trilogy, I feel like, is just very unique. As I mentioned in that clip, definitely blends a few different genres together, creating just a super cool experience. I feel like that was very effective. Starting out as this very traditional medieval fantasy story about our main character coming of age and seeking to take the throne back from her like evil like uncle sort of situation, and then having to sort of bring stability and power back to this kingdom as outside forces are also interested in sort of taking it over, if you will. So like very traditional but interesting and well written like political fantasy in like a high fantasy setting. But the book really expands and goes into lots of different directions that I just felt like was so refreshing and interesting to read at the time, and something I still 100% would stand by now. So like, yes, 100% stand by this rec. It is so good. Again, I don't think it would make my top 10 now, but like I would still definitely recommend those books. All right, moving on to book 3. Let's see what we got.
YA trilogy I marathoned earlier this year, and that is the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy by Rae Carson. Rae Carson has fast become one of my all-time favorite authors this year.
This series I recall rocking my world. Like, I haven't reread it since, but it's a YA trilogy I definitely see myself rereading and feeling like I would still really enjoy it.
This particular YA series to me defies all tropes and expectations to just the nth degree. This is an amazing and beautiful story that honestly, the character arcs that you experience through this is just astonishing.
It's interesting that I said that this series defies all tropes and expectations of YA. I don't think that's technically the case. What I can say is why I think I probably felt that way at the time is that I was reading a lot of like 2013 to 2015 era YA, which had a very specific stylization to it. And I think this just happens within books. Like there's certain trends that are very popular. This was the dystopian trend, if you will. So I think encountering a really traditional high fantasy story that centered a female main character with a very nuanced and emotional sort of main character story arc that wasn't necessarily rooted in the very popular story structures that I was reading at the time. The thing is, the series is very well done, and I would highly recommend it still to this day. But in this series by Rae Carson, we follow our main character who is the second daughter within a kingdom. So she's not the heir, and she's always sort of been the black sheep of the family, cast aside. And she was also born with this jewel embedded in her body, which makes her like this very important religious figure. So she's often othered by people around her, one, because of her religious standing, but also because she's kind of the spare heir, meaning she doesn't have a lot of people close to her. At the beginning of book 1, a variety of events occur, resulting in her actually getting involved with like rebellion and sort of having to leave the kingdom and castle that she grew up in, opening her eyes to like the larger world and to layers of the world she never previously had a chance to experience. It is a chosen one story, but I do feel like it goes into a lot of really interesting directions that just made it a fantastic YA fantasy series that I recall. Again, I haven't read it in a very long time, but I remember loving it, and still to this day it feels like a YA series that I would still very, very, very much enjoy, and I can see why it made this list at the time, because it was really good.
We have a recent favorite.
All right, next we have a recent favorite according to me. What was popular in 2017? I wonder if it came out in 2017 or I just like encountered it for the first time in 2017.
And that is the Three Dark Crowns, One Dark Throne.
Okay, I did love this series so much during this time period. See what I have to say.
This is a sinister story full of a lot of different perspectives and a lot of twists and turns you would not expect. It's deliciously dark and something that just honestly intrigues me to no end every time I turn the page. I just don't know where Kendra Blake's gonna bring it next. I have read the only 2 books that are out right now, but there is a short story coming out soon, which you best believe I'm gonna be picking up, and a third novel to this, which, to describe how much this book takes me by surprise, I honestly couldn't even tell you what could possibly happen next.
This is another YA series I still have like a fond connection to. It's also a series I still own, which I think speaks to the overall quality of it. This feels like a trendsetter book, I feel like. I just kind of spoke to genre trends, and I feel like this series came out during the waning of one set of YA trends and sort of the beginning of the next set, and I feel like this really established this sort of darker, more sinister tone, sort of leaning into some of the tropes that were happening in traditional adult fantasy at the time, sort of grimdark, Joe Abercrombie, these types of things, but bringing it to a YA space, and again, a lot of fun. Concept of this book, I still totally believe is such a cool one, set on this sort of magical island. We have these different factions who are all vying for power of this island, and they all have like a different subset of magic. One focuses on poison, one focuses on elemental magic, and the last focuses on animals. 3 triplets were born but separated at birth, so they were all raised separately from one another, and now they have to compete against each other, and the surviving sister takes all the power. Conceptually speaking, so cool, and I think the island, the lore, magic, and world building of this world was like really well done. I will say the quality of the series does drop off, and I think the unpredictability and the darkness of it really shined in the first 2 books. I do think it still sort of followed the path of YA in terms of it really trying to like break the norms. I can't say it 100% did through the end of the series in terms of like catching you by surprise, but I still do think it's like a fun, darker YA series that I thought was like well plotted, a good writing style. I was really captivated by the whole thing from beginning to end. Do I wish it pushed the envelope like a little bit further, especially by the last couple of books? Yes. Would I still say it's like a solid YA series? Yes. Would I say it's like my favorite fantasy series of all time? No. But it was so much fun in 2017.
Moving on to a hefty adult fantasy recommendation.
A hefty adult fantasy recommendation. What could it be?
We've got the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. This is my favorite Brent Weeks series by far, and one of my all-time favorite book series. It's just incredible. The magic system in this is what just makes it just amazing. Let me set these down.
I wonder how much 2017 Reagan would judge me if I told her that I still have not read the last book in this series, and I've had to basically start rereading this series because I've also forgotten pretty much everything about the plot. I obviously know like high level what sort of happened, but jumping into the last book, I was like, I need to reread stuff because it's all gone.
This particular series follows a huge cast of characters, from good to bad to middle ground people. We see them maneuver within this complex web of this political society, but as I've mentioned before, my favorite element to this series is by far the magic system. This is a world centered around magic wielders being able to use the spectrum of light.
I will say, Asked Me is not wrong. The coolest part of this series is the magic system. This is probably another fantasy series with time that I can acknowledge fondly of liking at the time, but have since read things that I've enjoyed more and maybe a little bit more complex high fantasy. This is one of the first like longer adult fantasy series I ever really tackled, which is great and amazing. And this series is one of those series I feel like is a great one to check out, especially if you're newer to adult fantasy. There are definitely some sort of problematic elements to the characterization of this series, particularly the female characters, but I'll say Brent Weeks really did the dang thing with the concept of the magic system, and it's very plot forward, so like the twists and turns of this series were wild and so much fun. But if you're not familiar, the Lightbringer series is a very large multi-POV series that's also like very military and war focused. There's lots of conflict, lots of action within this series. Magic system is cool around the concept of the spectrum of light and focuses on people that can harness different colors of the spectrum of light, and every color has like a different ability, but there is one specific catch with the magic system in this world. The more you use it, the quicker you die. So there's like a real trade-off to being like magically powerful in this society, and also a very obvious trade-off for the decision of going to war, because even if you survive the battle that day, your lifespan is like dramatically cut down. There is one individual within this world that can utilize all the colors. They're called the Prism. We do read and follow the Prism. It's this whole thing. Like, utilizes a lot of classic tropes. Chosen one figure, a boy from like the middle of nowhere who's really powerful, having to go to magic school. I love magic school. That was fun. Definitely a series I'm interested to reread. But again, like I feel like a great introductory high fantasy series for sure.
Next up, I have a duology to recommend, which I feel like is a rare thing.
A duology? Oh, I think it's gotta be what I think it is, right? I have a guess.
To find in fantasy, as most of these series are very long, and that is the Six of Crow duology by Leigh Bardugo. This is a
I was right.
fantastic dark YA fantasy story that has a lot of really unique historical elements I feel like woven in as inspiration. This is a story that follows a ragtag team of criminals who, let's just say, aren't so morally pure, but they kind of have to band together to steal an impossible item to kind of like save the world a bit.
Okay, Six of Crows, a classic. Truly a classic. Cannot deny the power of this duology. And you know what? I will stand by it as a recommendation. This is a great duology to check out if you're newer to fantasy. It's very engaging. It's very fun. Who doesn't love a heist story that centers a found family component? The fantasy inspirations are really fun, very effective. Leigh Bardugo has a very captivating writing style that is clear in terms of what she's trying to describe and get across, but also has an element of stylization that I also feel like adds a flair to her overall books and stories. I feel like a very defining YA duology. This series also feels like a big part of like moving from one era of YA to another. A solid recommendation, a solid YA fantasy series that I still think is probably really great. Again, wouldn't make my list today. I feel kind of like a broken record. But like, who doesn't love Six of Crows? That series is a blast. Clear trend of this video too, I will say, is there's a lot of YA fantasy here, which makes so much sense given the era and the time period in which I was reading books and also making videos in. So it's kind of fun to see the evolution of my reading tastes. I also think it's really cool because while maybe I have moved on from some of these series, some of the elements of these books that I loved so much, I can see a trend seeing these story elements in other series that I adore maybe more now. It's kind of fun to see like how my taste has evolved. Like it hasn't so much changed, but just sort of reached a new level. But the inputs of what I really enjoy, I feel like is pretty consistent, which I think is like just really fun to see, you know? Alrighty, let us see what is next.
Speaking of coats, I now have to recommend one of my most recent completed fantasy series reads that has fast become one of my favorite series of all time, and that is the Darker Shades of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab on itself with every single book. The first novel is fun, full of adventure, lighthearted, great characters. Second book, we get a little darker, we get a little more invested. Third book, it's all over for you.
I liked the giggle. She's not wrong. Second book I think is my favorite in the trilogy. It definitely does get better through the trilogy, which I think is always nice. I liked the first one, but there was no sophomore slump, which is so disappointed when it comes to fantasy trilogies because you hope things just like build on itself, but that's not always going to be the case. Yeah. I like this series too.
You're gonna love characters, you're gonna hate characters, you're just gonna wanna cry, curl up in a ball, scream for joy. This book series has it all. Victoria.
I was really emotionally impacted by this series, it appears, which is so funny because I don't remember that in hindsight, but like I must have been very emotionally impacted by this at the time. But what is this series about? Conceptually, another really strong idea and something that I would still really be drawn to in a fantasy series to this day. One, to either read this or read something similar to this, but basically this is set in a world where there are 4 parallel Londons, and all of these different versions of London have a different level of magic. We follow our main character Kel, who's able to travel between all of these Londons, and he is based in a place called Red London, which is like rich and flourishing in magic. He runs into our other main character Layla in Grey London, which has no magic, but she kind of has a little bit of spark of something. I will say I always enjoyed this character. She was sort of this pirate thief figure. A lot of people do decry that she's kind of like a not like other girls girl, but hey, you know what, it was 2017. Go on an adventure, they go to these other Londons that have different levels of, you know, instability with magic. There's conflict, there's drama. Book 2 has like a competition element to it, which I liked. It was a really fun trilogy that I also got Clay to read, and he also really enjoyed it. Again, another like great place to start if you're newer to adult high fantasy, because I do feel like it is utilizing some tropes that you would definitely run into in YA, but I feel like it's taken to a place that's more serious, a little more intense, a little more unpredictable, which I feel like is a great bridge if you're newer to the genre. Also why I liked it so much.
Next up is a underrated fantasy series. I feel like the first book gained some traction.
Actually so curious what this is. Underrated fantasy series.
But I honestly have not heard many people read and finish this entire trilogy, but
I must have been a fortune teller.
So good. And that is the Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson. The first one is The Kiss of Deception.
Did I know book talk was coming? This is so funny. Honestly, this series got its flowers, just maybe a little bit later in its release schedule than they would have ever anticipated. Remnant Chronicles, Kiss of Deception. Wow, yes. Okay, so the Kiss of Deception took booktube by storm when it came out, I think in like 2015, 2016. It kind of fell off. And if you're familiar with Book Talk, it's one of those fantasy series that just like regained a lot of popularity well after its original publication run, which is really cool. And I'm glad more people sort of found this series and loved it, because I obviously really enjoyed it way back in the day. This is a series I've since sort of unhauled, but I will say it's a very unique setup for a YA trilogy. And while it maybe continued on in a more expected pattern, the initial introduction to the series is super cool. And I feel like a great gateway for a lot of people. I was obsessed with this when I read it at the time. The idea is, the first one's called The Kiss of Deception, and our main character runs away from this arranged marriage, and she's pursued by two figures: the husband that she was supposed to marry and an assassin who was sent to kill her. You read from all of these perspectives, but you don't know which guy is which. And it creates a lot of really interesting like tension, and it's just like a clever idea that I think the author actually executed super well. All right, we have the last series. I feel like it's going to have one of my still current favorite fantasy series of all time.
Say and recommend as one of my favorite book series of all time in the fantasy genre, and that is the Thief series by Megan Wallen Turner. This is
I love this series. This series took me by surprise when I first picked it up during this year that I filmed this video, and I love it. I actually hope to reread this series this year. It's just so good. Like so good.
Another fantasy series I recently wrapped up, I'm talking like last week wrapped up, but has just exceeded my expectations, blown my mind, and just has done so well to my heart. This is a story set in a world very much modeled off of ancient Greece. In the first novel, we follow our main character, who is a thief.
So if you're not familiar with the Thief series, it's basically set in a fantasy-inspired like ancient Greek setting. And there are these different kingdoms that exist in this landscape that have been at war with each other for a long time. At the beginning of book one, we're introduced to our first main character named the Thief. And we find him in book one in prison, and he basically makes a deal with the ruler of the land that he will help him find this like impossible object and steal it for him. So he then sets out on a journey. It's so funny and clever and so classic. This is a series that centers a main character that will constantly trick you, make you laugh, catch you by surprise. He's just very endearing, and then combines that with like a really intriguing plot line that evolves so successfully, and also just has such a great element of storytelling and like mythos at the heart of the book. I adore it. I adored it then. I adore it now. This is probably like my favorite series of this video that I've recommended. In terms of like when I think about some of my favorite series, this one is definitely like still stayed like really high on the list for me. Alrighty guys, that is my list of all-time favorite fantasy books from 2017. My reaction to those books in present day. Honestly, I stand by like every single recommendation pretty much on this list. For the most part, I can see why I loved all of these books in 2017, and I can see how people would still, one, reach and enjoy many of these books to this day. A lot of these books I would still fully recommend with my full chest. Some of them I definitely feel like I've sort of grown past, but I can still reflect fondly on them even from the future and see why I definitely loved them as much as I did during this time period. This is always so fun. It's also funny to see kind of how things have changed through time, how my channel has changed through time. But regardless, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye!